Watch this.
Idaho's pandemic strategy has been touted as being very independent. It's kind of the Idaho way, right? But how is that meshing with national medical experts? Private employers have already started requiring COVID vaccinations for their employees. And now, government agencies are doing the same. Yes, it's happening in Idaho, but not by Idaho.
It is a passive park and is one that adds a great deal of culture and history to the city of Boise.
They certainly weren't the first pioneers of Boise, but they did provide the city with its first ribbon of jewels along the river. How the park got the name of Julia Davis. The Idaho way. We do it how we want, when we want. And nobody from the outside is going to tell us how or when we do that. Kind of taking the same approach when it comes to COVID-19, although we were reminded repeatedly during those early days of the pandemic, we were following the guidance from the federal government. These days, just like those days, while most decisions are made in Idaho that regard to Idaho, that guidance is still a thing. The state works in coordination with the federal government on things like health recommendations and operations like the vaccine rollout. And we still hear a lot from our local medical experts and leaders. But we wanted to get a perspective from a larger viewpoint, the federal level. We heard just last week from area medical providers, Idaho's heading in the wrong direction and something needs to change here. Well, how does our situation fit into the national situation? Joe Paris spoke with White House COVID Task Force Senior Advisor Dr. Cameron Webb about the rising cases, the vaccine rollout, and the game of getting accurate info to people who are looking for it. Dr. Webb specializes in medical equity and is also currently working at the University of Virginia at the hospital there. He was selected to the White House COVID-19 response team as a senior advisor back in January.
As Idaho healthcare leaders sound the alarm on what they say is a concerning trend of recent COVID cases, the problem is not unique to the Gem State.
We're looking around the country, we're seeing increases in cases all over. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we're having a lot of conversations with state leaders. And, between my colleagues and myself, we're really reaching out to governor's offices, state health officers, and making sure we're doing everything we can while we're seeing this increase in cases largely driven by this Delta variant. And so I think that everywhere is on high alert because this is a critical moment in this pandemic.
White House COVID Task Force Senior Advisor Dr. Cameron Webb explains what types of conversations the White House COVID team is having with states like Idaho, seeing COVID trends heading in the wrong direction.
But what we keep saying is that every state should be thinking about the full range of interventions that they can offer to keep their state and its residents safe. And I think that's really the critical moment that we're in.
Idaho is currently behind the national average in major vaccine metrics. State data indicates, for example, that 45.6% of those 12 and over are fully vaccinated, while the national average is in that category at 57.5%. Idaho trails national averages in similar categories as well. Some say this is evidence that everyone who wants a vaccine has one at this point, but Dr. Webb says he would push back on that notion.
The key is that for a lot of the unvaccinated, we have more than enough data that tells us that for some large percentage of them, it's more a matter of they're still having questions. They may still have questions about the safety or the efficacy of the vaccines. They're not at an absolute no as much as it is that they want more information. And I think that the answer here is to make sure that we are creating spaces and opportunities for folks to get their questions answered.
Dr. Webb says now is a crucial time for places like Idaho. He says recently other places like Idaho have seen action from the community as a result of increasing cases.
If you look at the states that have the highest number of cases right now, they actually have an above the national average rate of vaccination, because when people are faced with rising cases in their community, that's even more of an impetus for them to say, well, maybe now is the right time for me to get vaccinated, because people always want to protect themselves, and that's an important way to do so.
For months, there have been questions about how to reach underserved communities where English may not be the preferred language with valuable COVID resources and information. Dr. Webb has this insight on that challenge that some Idaho communities are facing.
When people have equal access to information and equal access to resources, the resource here being the vaccine, they tend to make similar decisions when it comes to their best health interest. I think sometimes it's a matter of reaching people through the right individual. We know in a lot of communities, that's community health workers or promotores. We know that sometimes that's a matter of making sure that it's linguistically appropriate conversations and interactions. Sometimes it's a matter of making sure that people know that the vaccines are free, that there's going to be no immigration enforcement, that this vaccine is for them as well. I think that there's been certainly an impact of policies in recent years that have made people feel more reticent to seek public services or public help.
So the key obviously is getting the information out there. You guys talked about that, but did you talk about like how we get that information out there?
Yeah, and that's really going to depend on state to state. I know the Department of Health and Welfare here in Idaho, Brian, they've been working to get into specific communities with targeted information. The problem is it takes time and it really takes trust for some communities to take this information, disperse it within their own community, and then decide really how they feel about it. It's not an overnight battle, and that's the thing I talked about with Dr. Webb, is that these are things that do take time. And unfortunately, we're in a time situation right now where we do have rising case counts. We do have this much more contagious Delta variant heading into the fall. And it really is, you give the people the best information you can. And Brian, you really just hope that they make the best decisions.
And maybe we're spoiled because we're used to this and want this warp speed mentality, and it just doesn't work at that rate all the time. All right, thanks, Joe. All right, less than 2 months from now, employees of Idaho's 3 major healthcare providers are going to have to get the COVID-19 vaccine or possibly get another job. And of course, in the roughly 2 weeks since that announcement, we have seen and heard the speculation that it won't stop there, which prompted Chris to text us this. Idaho health employers aren't the only ones mandating vaccines, happening back east. And yes, that message is now true, kind of, because Chris sent that message, I should say, last Thursday. But it wasn't until today that New York City made it a requirement for all city workers, which includes police officers and teachers, to get the COVID-19 vaccine or get tested weekly for the virus. And to be clear, it's not a vaccine mandate, just a get the vaccine or get tested rule. Meanwhile, the state of California made the same requirement today of all its state employees and all its healthcare workers across the state, something that would affect at least 238,000 state workers and more than 2 million healthcare workers. And as much as you like to talk about things coming out of California, let's turn our attention back to the 208, because there's now another Idaho healthcare provider requiring the COVID-19 vaccine, saying it's the best way to keep veterans safe, especially as the Delta variant spreads. This afternoon, the Department of Veterans Affairs became the first major federal agency to require vaccinations of its healthcare workers. And this is meant for all who fall under what they call Title 38 employees, that umbrella. And that includes physicians, physician's assistants, and registered nurses. But it also includes all dentists, podiatrists, optometrists, and just about anyone who offers direct care to veterans. So how does that translate to Boise's VA hospital? Well, we asked that question specifically today, and we were told, well, roughly 70% of Boise's VA hospital employees are vaccinated. However, we weren't told, or we weren't sure how that translates to the group covered by Title 38, how much of a percentage that actually is that will be required by this new rule. Nor do we know if it will be a get vaxxed or get axed kind of scenario, or if there will be exemptions. We're told those details are still being worked out, and we're still waiting on those final numbers from Boise's VA hospital. But we do know those employees will have 8 weeks from Wednesday to be fully vaccinated. And before you start with the emails and text messages saying, see, vaccine requirements are spreading faster than the virus itself, and we're next. Well, the state of Idaho requiring the same of its people or employees, that seems very unlikely still. That's because of the executive order signed by Governor Brad Little last April. That prevents any state agency from requiring any proof of COVID-19 vaccination to get into a state facility or receive a public service. So while some states and cities are now requiring certain employees to get a COVID shot, Idaho still isn't. And unless Governor Little rescinds, repeals, or replaces his executive order, we likely won't. Up in the foothills or down by the river, it shouldn't be a shock to see wildlife wander into your yard. However, what if it decides to lay low on your lawn for a while? And there's been a big game decision from the McCall City Council. The pleas to please don't feed the animals will stay just that. Our plea to you, join our conversation. Want to talk wildlife? Vent about vaccines? Complain about the air quality? Or maybe have something positive to say? Tell us your thoughts in a text 208-321-5614. Just be sure to include your name and the hashtag the208. Oh, and keep them short so we can share as many as we can at the end of the show.
He's having a real problem, and he got up once when I first saw him in the backyard, but then he's been laying there just ever since.
Cindy Wyatt lives in Garden City, mere blocks from the Boise River. And last night, she said she noticed this deer wandering near her home. After being seen in several of her neighbors' backyards, Cindy says it finally just settled in hers. And as you just heard her say, he's been laying there ever since. She said she's avoided going into the backyard last night and even most of today, even kept the dog inside. Cindy says she thinks it's injured, the deer that is, hurt in one of its right legs. So, like most might, a wild animal appears to be hurt and beds down in your backyard. Maybe you should call somebody to come get it? Well, Cindy said she ended up on the phone with Idaho Fish and Game asking if they or someone could come to rescue and rehabilitate the deer. But Cindy wasn't too fond of their answer.
Well, their definition of rescue is let nature take its course. That's what they told me when I called. And consequently, my understanding is they'll put him down then if he doesn't get up and get going on his own.
Well, sort of. It's really not quite as simple as that. Fish and Game told us today they treat these cases, or these cases, I should say, on a case-by-case basis. And while the first response is none at all, leave the animal alone, and as you heard Cindy say, let nature take its course, they can and have trapped and relocated them. However, they say injured deer and elk, animals of that size, often don't rehab very well under the care of people. And you'd be surprised at how resilient animals of this size can be, they said. The official answer to Cindy's inquiry: we understand people's concerns in these situations and their desire to fix these wounded animals, but the best course is usually letting wildlife remain wild with as little human intervention as possible. And guess what? That deer did leave Cindy's yard earlier today, just hopped over that 4-foot fence and was off. Still, Fish and Game says if you do see a wounded animal in your yard, call them. Don't hesitate, and they will decide on how to proceed from there. If it's a severe injury or a safety risk, like a big buck with antlers, they would likely take action. Speaking of animals wandering into the yards of people who live in the city of McCall has been trying to keep said animals out of said city by banning the feeding of wildlife. It was a safety issue, they said, with deer hanging out in town instead of following their natural migration patterns. This wasn't new either, though. It's been happening for decades. But with the population of the herd and the people of McCall both growing, they thought, well, something should be done about it. And after several meetings and one clerical error, the ordinance came up for a vote last Thursday. And it failed, 3-2, with one council member flipping their original vote. So what happens next?
I think we did hear clearly that we would definitely like to work as hard as we can on public education.
Public education. Well, Councilmember Melanie Holmes went on to say the entire ordeal has made people reconsider feeding those herds. And she said some will change their own habits whether or not they do that. But if the feeding habits don't change, the council could bring it up again next year. From apple orchard to ash heap to the crown of Boise's ribbon of jewels. Today, it's a must-visit destination park in the middle of downtown Boise. But before we get to that, let's get to this. Text us your comments and questions about the show. And if you're new to the 208, here's our number, 208-321-5614. Include your name and the hashtag #the208. We're going to try to respond to as many as we can at the end of the show, so stick around. All right, time for our 208 history lesson. City of Boise, founded in 1864, but it would be decades before the downtown core would actually begin to take shape as we know it. But even before that, two early Boise pioneers turned what was once a thriving apple orchard into a downtown park in the early 1900s. We know it today as Julia Davis Park, located in the heart of downtown Boise. It's on Broadway, or located right next to it. You can see it there outlined in green. Broadway on the right side of the screen, Boise State, the bottom right, downtown Boise, hugging it to the north. That's a part of the screen up there. It's not only Boise's oldest park, but it's the first of what's known as the Ribbon of Jewels, a series of parks named after prominent local women, including Ann Morrison and Esther Simplot. We'll get to more on those ladies on another day. It was the late 1800s, about 35 years after the city of Boise was founded, and Boise's first park began to kind of take shape. Now, more than 100 years after that, this Riverside Park has become a must-see destination.
In Julia Davis Park, you can actually come and have some quiet time. You can have a quiet picnic, or you can wander in the rose garden.
It is a passive park and is one that adds a great deal of culture and history to the city of Boise.
Like most, that Boise story started somewhere else. In 1862, Thomas Jefferson Davis headed west out of Cincinnati with his brother Frank. The goal? To get rich with gold.
Tom came as a miner, and he took the first water right out of the Boise River.
Precious metal proved elusive for Davis, but he eventually found something many consider more precious: true love. In 1869, Julia McCrum came from Ontario, Canada to visit family in Boise. when she met the red-headed stranger.
He was really tall and redheaded.
And they quickly became quite the couple.
She wasn't very tall.
By 1871, they were married and together helped plot out the growing city of Boise.
He was a very progressive. He wanted to see Boise expand. And so she fit right in. They were quite a team, the two of them.
Julia became known as the welcome wagon of Boise, helping immigrants traveling on the Oregon Trail who stopped along the river to rest.
She was a really, really nice lady. She would come down to the park, which was still an apple orchard, and bring things for the pioneers.
They grew apples, and it was really conveniently located next to the river for irrigation.
That orchard was prone to flooding, and Tom considered conferring it to the city for its first public park.
Their first offer was actually in 1899.
They offered it at 8 times.
The city was concerned about the cost of having a park and taking that responsibility on, so they kept pushing back on it.
That is, until 1907, when Julia passed away.
And so finally, when Julia died, Tom said, "You will take the park and you will name it after her, and it will forever be known that."
They saw an opportunity to really create a park with a vision before we ever even had, a downtown, before we even had connectivity through, through the Boise River corridor.
But because of its water issues, it wasn't exactly an instant park. In fact, in its early years, it was used as the city dump.
They layered mattresses and clothes and other items like that on the bottom layer, and then they put other bottles and other trash on top of that, and then just over the years built up the land and covered it with grass.
But by the 1920s, it started to take shape as a more appropriate public space.
We really refer to this park as our cultural park, and that really happened organically over time.
And over time, the cultural buildings we know today started showing up, like the Gene Harris Bandshell, the Boise Art Museum, the History Museum, and the iconic Rose Garden.
The Rose Garden itself dates to 1939. It was dedicated by a group called the Cutworms. They were a male-only gardening club, and in 1938 they had planted 1,500 roses from Portland and another 300 from a New York nursery.
The most recent additions, like the Black History Museum, continue the cultural aspects of the park.
One of the last pieces that we will do will be the celebration pavilion at the east end of the park, and it'll look like the Ag Pavilion, but we'll celebrate the fact that we were done.
All under the watchful eye of the Davis family legacy.
And so I think when you look at how this park turned out, it is exactly what she wanted.
It took more than a century to put more than just Julia's name on the park.
The Davis family was not very well known because things had changed in our lives, and so we wanted Julia to be explained.
A 2005 design competition helped visualize the branches of the Davis family tree.
It is a growing family tree, yes. And right below it is Tom and Julia's family, and then that family expands out to here, and then all of my family, our families, spread out to here. So when you come here, I hope it's easier to understand exactly who all these descendants are.
We're going to put in some more concrete possibly, because Michael Gard says the family's planning 4 weddings this summer, which means that family tree is going to be expanding. And there's one more piece the city is working to install by the end of the year. It's called Fly High, and it's going to be a window near the Ag Pavilion along the river pathway, honoring the men and women who have died in combat, including Michael Gard's late son-in-law, Jeff. If you'd like to contribute to that final piece, we've got a link in this story at ktvb.com. All right, final minute of the show. Let's get to your comments that you send in, like this one from James. If the vaccine worked, they shouldn't mandate getting the shot. If you're scared, get it. If you are not, you shouldn't be forced to. Maybe if the government didn't try so hard to force it on you, maybe more would get it. Well, James says that, but that's kind of responded by this text from Bill. The longer the current strain of COVID circulates, the greater the probability that another variant emerges that our current vaccine won't protect against. Sounds like Bill's been doing some reading. Bottom line, get vaccinated to save lives. Yes, there is a vast population that isn't, which allows that to spread and mutate a little bit more. What happened with freedom of choice, asks this anonymous texter, which seems to be answered by Doug. As we said in the military, we can't make you do it, but we can sure make you wish you had. That seems to kind of the mentality as well. Maybe some incentives out there to do that. We'll talk about some more stuff tomorrow. We'll see you then.